This tube is the gospel, the ultimate revelation. This tube can make or break presidents, popes, prime ministers. This tube is the most awesome goddamn force in the whole godless world. And woe is us if it ever falls into the hands of the wrong people. And that's why woe is us that Edward George Ruddy died. Because this company is now in the hands of CCA, the Communication Corporation of America. There's a new chairman of the board, a man called Frank Hackett, sitting in Mr. Ruddy's office on the 20th floor. And when the 12th largest company in the world controls the most awesome goddamn propaganda force in the whole godless world, who knows what shit will be peddled for truth on this network?
The 1976 film Network satirizes a media where the competition for advertising and ratings cultivates sensationalism. The line between news and entertainment becomes blurred. Journalistic integrity succumbs to the ever-encroaching commercialism of television. This is arguably an accurate picture of the world we live in today. Ever since the Communications Act of 1934, which handed broadcasting rights over to private interests, media has become more centralized and increasingly focused on its bottom line. In the present day, 3 organizations have come to dominate the cable news field. These are CNN, owned by Warner Media, NBC, owned by Comcast, and Fox News, owned by the Murdoch family. Americans like to think of their country as a nation with a free press, unlike the totalitarian regimes of China or Russia, where dissent is strictly censored. However, the news coverage by the U.S. mass media monopoly seldom goes against the state's narrative, whether right or wrong, and seems to utilize a less formal mode of censorship. Why is this the case? And why has the so-called free press been wrong about issues ranging from the Iraq War to global warming to Medicare for all?
Everywhere people go, they want refreshment. At home, on the road, at the ball game, or wherever.
The First Amendment of the United States Constitution states, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. But there are limitations on free speech that have been upheld by the judicial branch of the government. Notable exceptions prevent people from inciting violence or distributing obscene material. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1919 expanded these limitations to ban speech that may undermine the American government's war effort. Under these acts, one of the first indictments was dealt to the editors of Mother Earth magazine for allegedly encouraging men to resist military conscription. After the editors Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman spent 2 years in federal prison, their citizenship was revoked and they were deported to the Soviet Union along with approximately 300 others for the publication of materials the Woodrow Wilson administration found inconvenient. Even in times of peace, when there is no draft, hundreds of people have been jailed for allegedly interfering with military recruitment. Their crimes were merely the publication of materials shedding light on U.S.-backed proxy wars such as the Civil War in Nicaragua, even though no U.S. troops were officially involved. Though many have been arrested for reporting or leaking facts about U.S. military involvement around the world, the cable news monopoly of CNN, NBC, and Fox has mostly avoided any legal entanglement simply because they are ubiquitous in their advocacy for war.
I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons."
Perhaps the most extreme example of this advocacy can be seen in their coverage of the Iraq War, which began in 2003.
I doubt that in a conflict of this type there's ever been the degree of free press coverage as you are witnessing in this instance.
The United States had recently experienced its most devastating terror attack on September 11, 2001, which was perpetrated by Al-Qaeda. The pretext for entering what would become a decade-spanning war were that Iraq's dictator, Saddam Hussein, was building weapons of mass destruction and was working with al-Qaeda. Neither of these turned out to be true. As International Press Institute editor David Dadge pointed out, the American media failed to ask the tough questions of an administration that seemed determined to go to war. Beyond just accepting a faulty state narrative, the U.S. media outlets actively took on a nationalistic stance. Political and media scientist Kai Hafez described the coverage of the war in 2003. U.S. networks stirred public emotions with special reports entitled Countdown Iraq on MSNBC or Showdown with Saddam on CBS. The BBC's chief, Greg Dyke, attacked U.S. broadcasters, saying they not only revealed a clear pro-American bias during war coverage, but that many of them were outright patriotic and heated up public opinion during the war. Fox News, being the #1 news channel in the U.S. ahead of CNN, was generally considered strongly committed to the U.S. government position. The coverage was intended to bolster public support for the war. However, the U.S. cable news media is not completely one-sided. This can make it hard to see why the state narrative is being promulgated in a system that lacks the kind of formal censorship seen in totalitarian states. Cable news and other media usually allows for some dissent and the discussion of inconvenient facts, though these viewpoints are usually marginalized. In the case of the Iraq War, a small group of cable news presenters did allow anti-war sentiments to air. But these programs were quickly canceled and their hosts fired or forced to resign, as was the case with Phil Donahue on MSNBC and many others. The executive decisions to show or not show certain topics is deeper than the fear of prosecution under the Espionage Act. Despite the privatization of media, which subjects news coverage to market forces, the media and government are still deeply intertwined. The government employs media management strategies which are intended to overwhelm journalists with information from its official sources. Relying heavily on these official reports, the media most often ends up reporting a narrative that the state intended to project anyway. This can be observed in efforts such as the World War I-era Committee on Public Information, which used the media to make a largely pacifist public support the war. In the 1960s with Operation Mockingbird, which did the same thing during the Vietnam War, but also outright bought many magazines and student publications. And the various unreliable sources disseminated by the Bush administration to promote the invasion of Iraq. Authoritative sources of information that reject the state's narrative exist, however, these are often overwhelmed by the government's efforts. Various experts are sometimes put on the payroll of government agencies, forming organizations which have become known as think tanks. The purpose of a think tank is to create press releases which reach conclusions favorable to their financiers' interests. This is another method the government uses to curtail expert opinion to its needs. Besides official government sources, businesses and trade groups are often a source that journalists go to for information. Corporate press releases and think tanks financed by the fossil fuel industry have had adverse effects on news coverage of climate change, also called global warming. Roughly since the 1960s, a majority of scientists have reported a troubling connection between the burning of fossil fuels and the rise in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. This trend will lead to a warming of the Earth by several degrees over the next century, causing increasingly hazardous weather conditions and a scarcity of resources such as clean water and food. At least since 2010, 97% of published papers support this conclusion about climate change. Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky found in 1988 that large corporate advertisers on television will rarely sponsor programs that engage in serious criticisms of corporate activities such as the problem of environmental degradation, the workings of the military-industrial complex, or corporate support for third world tyrannies. This means that coverage of global warming as a scientific consensus will come as a financial loss for the network just as anti-war content would. Therefore, when climate change is discussed, it is presented as a debate, often with misleading data rather than scientific consensus. According to an article in the International Journal of Sociology and Social Policy in 2003, global warming has been a well-recognized environmental issue in the U.S. for the past 10 years. Debate about the issue is found in U.S. media coverage, while controversy among the majority of scientists is rare. This is a representation of climate science on the most conservative of the three cable news channels, Fox News. But all three major news channels are guilty of this misrepresentation.
Right, so Mark Morano, if there is a massively increased acceleration in CO2 in the atmosphere, at the same time that there's been a bigger than double the sizing of the population of the planet, why would that not be inexorably linked? Explain to me.
Well, CO2 is rising. No one's disputing that. What Bill Nye just did was waste everyone's time explaining that CO2 is rising. The question is, what impact does CO2 have on the weather? What impact does CO2 have on climate change? And that is where you look at the geologic record. We've had warmer periods where it's been with lower CO2, and we've had colder periods with higher CO2. And you have to go way back for some of that. But the bottom line is hundreds of factors are dictating our climate. The medieval warm period was both southern and northern hemisphere. On my website, there's literally, it demolishes the idea of a hockey stick, new peer-reviewed studies. So the idea that Bill Nye is just going around saying CO2 is up, therefore global warming is dangerous, we should be concerned, it's not. It's not dangerous. The bottom line is all these other factors.
Here, Mark Moreno was presented as a climate expert, but he's a former Republican political aide who runs a climate denial website. These facts may have an element of truth, but do not in themselves refute the science supporting man-made global warming. On NBC's Meet the Press, U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn debated Bill Nye again and stated erroneously,
"There is not agreement around the fact of exactly what is causing this."
Well, once again, the Congresswoman is trying to introduce doubt. And doubt in the whole idea of climate change. So what I would encourage everybody to do is back up and let's agree on the facts. Would you say that the Antarctic has less ice than it used to? When you asserted, Congresswoman, that a change from 320 to 400 parts per million is insignificant, my goodness, that's 30%. I mean, that's an enormous change.
Besides relying on information from corporate press releases, the media is also beholden to its sponsors, many of which are part of the fossil fuel industry. These misleading segments have an effect on public opinion, which allows the action taken by policymakers to be weak or non-existent amid serious threats to the environment.
Last Week Tonight presents a statistically representative climate change debate.
Good evening. Joining me tonight, a climate change denier and, naturally, Bill Nye Science Guy.
Bill? John?
Yep.
Humans are causing climate change? No question.
Wait. Before we begin, in the interest of mathematical balance, I'm going to bring out two people who agree with you, climate skeptic, and Bill Nye, I'm also going to bring out 96 other scientists. It's a little unwieldy, but this is the only way you can actually have a representative discussion. Please file in.
Another area where bias in cable news is evident is in coverage of the U.S. healthcare system. A public option in healthcare is when the government provides medical services for an affordable price without requiring the user to purchase private insurance. When the Affordable Care Act, or ACA, was being drafted, polls suggested that at least 66% of Americans supported a public option, making it arguably the most popular component of the bill. Among doctors, support is even higher. Because multivariate analysis has shown that economic and business elites have a greater impact on legislation than popular opinion, predictably the public option was left out of the ACA despite its popularity. A large part of the reason for removing it was resistance from private insurers, providers, and other interest groups who lobbied against it. The cable news channels used their position to resist the popular opinion on the issue, often airing segments critical of the public opinion. In the case of Fox News, a directive was handed down from the vice president of the company to refrain from using the term public option and instead call it the government option, in order to coincide with a Republican stance that it was an insidious government takeover of healthcare. The general fear about the public option among insurance providers was that it would drive them out of business, because releasing people from the requirement that they or their employers purchase health insurance for them would certainly cause a decrease in business for the insurance companies.
I believe that this bill, specifically the public option, is the first incremental step towards a single pay system. In the past, Obama himself has said that he is in favor of an eventual one-pay system. How will the private system be able to survive under this plan?
Well, I also say it will survive and prosper, the private insurance companies, if they provide better service. Remember, the argument against the public option is that when the government gets in, it will run it badly and that it will be too restrictive. I think there are contradictory arguments made against that plan. One is that when the government runs it, it will deny people free choice and it will be too restrictive, and two, it will be so attractive everybody will join it.
The U.S. healthcare system is unique in the world. While not a completely free market system, the U.S. has put great power into the hands of private companies who have inflated prices and created high government, private, and individual spending. The total spending, as well as spending per gross domestic product on healthcare, is higher than any country in the world, while coverage is far lower. 28 million people are uninsured, and many patients have foregone recommended treatment due to affordability issues. Private insurance was not always as large of an industry as it is today. Health insurance companies rely heavily on government regulations, such as Richard Nixon's employer mandate, without which they would struggle to find customers. This regulation forces businesses to purchase health care for their employees. Any serious attempt to extend health care to the uninsured will be highly disruptive to the private insurance industry. The cable news channels largely defend the current system against calls for alternatives, even though they have lower cost and wider coverage, because their sponsors in the private sector stand to lose revenue. While the public option is sometimes called Medicare for all who want it, Medicare for All is the name given to single-payer healthcare plans proposed by presidential candidates Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. These policies would put everyone on the same government plan, possibly eliminating insurance altogether. While still popular in polls, it is less politically safe than the public option proposals from President Joe Biden or the candidate Pete Buttigieg. However politically inconvenient, it is the best option for saving money and expanding coverage because it eliminates redundant private insurance bureaucracies. A single-payer healthcare system was considered by Congress in 1993. The Congressional Budget Office predicted it would reduce spending by 9%. Other more recent estimates predict that Medicare for All would save 10 to 13%, which constitutes hundreds of billions of dollars. While achieving universal coverage, the cable news channels often present this issue as a debate between radical socialists who are peddling unaffordable, pie-in-the-sky, utopian ideas, and the rational-minded critics on the left and right who oppose it.
You are an old man who thinks in terms of nations and peoples. There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no West. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today.
In conclusion, the mass media, particularly cable news in the United States, is deeply flawed for many complex reasons. The scope of reporting is limited by an institutional structure that is ultimately beholden to shareholders. Journalists are dependent on official sources and corporate press releases, which they have limited ability to question. Furthermore, the cable news media relies heavily on support from sponsors, many of which profit from the healthcare system, fossil fuels, and even war itself. There may be no way to make any media free of biases. However, the bias of the cable news networks are particularly extraordinary, and they closely resemble outright propaganda. News sources that maintain editorial independence from the state and greatly limit their corporate sponsorship are less likely to be biased. Examples include National Public Radio, Associated Press, and Al Jazeera. For better or worse, the digital age has led to the availability of news sources with any range of funding. However, the lack of authority of these sources gives them very little reliability. The term fake news has arisen in the past 5 years to refer to large swaths of internet articles that are misleading or outright false, yet are widely circulated on social media due to their sensationalist headlines. Ultimately, the best way to curb the spread of misinformation caused by biased and misleading reporting is a more educated public. Peer-reviewed academic research should be trusted, while quick and dirty research from think tanks should be regarded with grave skepticism. When consuming media, one should always consider the sources and be able to analyze the information in front of them. In reality, no individual has time to comb over every piece of available data and compose an accurate portrait of the complex world we live in. We rely on our news agencies to synthesize information for us, and I think it's fair to say we deserve better.
Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe, leave a comment, or ring the bell. And as always, have a great day.